Hello, my name is Noah Tucker, and I'll be here to help you with your CSE2 Intro to Programming Spring 2013 Exam 2, Question 1. Just want to make sure that the following things are in order. You want to make sure that the variables are properly initialized. You want to see where the print line statement is or the print statement is to make sure that you're printing it out the right amount of times, and then you just want to make sure that the code is actually able to run and that there's no runtime errors within the compiled code. So if you take a look at the code that is provided for you on the test, the instructions simply say put the standard output. If there's no output, write none. If it's an infinite loop, put an infinity in the box. So when we're going to look at the first coding, the first thing we have to think about is what does a loop do? So the first thing that you have to think about with loops is where's the initial value, where's the final value, or the other way to say that is how many times am I going to be running through the loop that is generated. So as you can see in this code, the two variables I and j are initialized as integers with values of 1 and 3 above the for loop. Now there's a possible error there in coding because if you don't initialize your values outside of the loop, it will not recognize them when you say, for example, system.out.println j. If j is not initialized before the loop, the code will not recognize j as a legitimate variable. It will only be recognized within the scope of the loop. So when you're initializing your variables with loops, you have to make sure to do it outside of the entire loop above it, because or else it may not get printed out when you use your system.out.println statement because of the scoping issues with loops. Okay, so now to look at the actual code. As you can see, as I already stated, I and j are already initialized, and then you look at your for loop, and it says for I equals 6, semicolon, I is greater than negative 6, semicolon, I equals I minus 2. Then within the loop it says j equals j times 2, and then outside of it it says system.out.println j, as we can see. So the first way that I'm going to look at this is I'm going to start with the loop that's given to me, and I'm going to say I equals 6. No matter how I was initialized outside of the loop, if it's given a value inside of it, that's the value that the program recognizes, that the compiler is going to recognize, and that's the value that's going to be stored for I. So now if we actually take a look at the code, as you can see, the code's going to run until I is equal to or less than negative 6. Now, less than a negative number means it's either going to be negative 6, negative 7, negative 8, negative 9, negative 10. Anything less than negative 6, which means more negative, the code is going to stop. And then the last thing that it says, where it says I equals I minus 2. The way that you think about that is after all the code has been written on the inside, you're going to take the initial value of I that it was that time it ran through. So for example, the first time you run through, it's going to be I equals 6. Then because it's I equals I minus 2, the second time you're going to run through it, it's going to be I equals 4. And then the third time I equals 2, and then I equals 0. And it's going to keep subtracting 2 until it reaches a point where the condition I is greater than negative 6 is no longer true. At that point, the code will stop. Okay, now to actually look at the code and what's going to happen. So the thing that we have to think about when you're doing this for loop, the system.out.println statement is not within the for loop, which means something is only going to get printed out once if something is going to get printed out at all. So now we have to go in and look and see how this loop is going to run. So the way that this loop is going to run is that it's going to start with I equals 6. It's going to check the condition I is greater than negative 6. 6 is greater than negative 6, so we're okay to run this code. So we're going to start out by saying j equals j times 2. So the value of j was initialized to 1. So now we're going to store this new value of j as 2 because 1 times 2 equals 2. So now j equals 2, and now that we're done running all the code inside of the for loop, we're now going to run the condition I equals I minus 2. So now instead of I being 6, I is now going to be equal to 4. And then we're going to run this again. It's going to say j equals j times 2. Since j is now equal to 2, because the first time we ran it, we initialized 1 times 2 equals 2. Now j is equal to 2, so now it's going to be 2 times 2, and the value of j equals 4 is going to be stored into that j value. Now we're going to do it again. We're going to subtract 2 from I. We're going to get to I equals 2. We're going to say j equals 4 times 2, so now j is equal to 8, and I is equal to 2. And now we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to keep running it. We're going to check that condition. We're going to subtract 2 from it. It's going to be I equals 0. Is 0 greater than negative 6? It is. We're going to keep running it through. We're going to say j equals j times 2. J now equals 8. So it's going to be 8 times 2, which is going to be 16. And then since that's the last thing we run, we're going to subtract 2 from I again. Negative 2 is greater than 6. Is that true? Absolutely, that's true. So we're going to keep running through the code. And now that j is 16, now it's going to be j equals 16 times 2, so that's going to be 32. And then we're going to subtract 2 from I again. We're going to have I equals negative 4. Negative 4 is still greater than negative 6, So we're going to have to do it one more time. We're going to have to say j equals 32 times 2. So j equals 64. Then we're going to subtract 2 from I and check the condition. It's going to say I equals negative 6. Now negative 6 is not greater than negative 6. It's actually equal to it. So therefore we can stop running the code and we can print out the final value that was created of j equals 64. Code snip B looks at nested for loops as opposed to singular for loops. So the same rules apply. You have to look for where your print line statement is, which in this one, it's inside of a for loop, which means every time that that loop runs, the code is going to get printed out. It's not only going to get printed out at the end. The second thing you have to look for is to make sure your variables are initialized, which they are. As you can see, I and j are initialized on top, and the integer k is initialized inside that for loop. So the way that this works is we're going to start with the innermost for loop of int k equals 0. And then we're going to run that as many times as k is less than j. Now since j, the second inner for loop, increments every time it runs through, j is going to start at 1. It's going to say k is equals 0, 0 is less than 1, run the code, add 1 to k is now not less than j, so increment j. Now j is going to be 2, k is going to be 0, and then k is going to run 0, and then it's going to increment to 1, and then 1 is still going to be less than 2 because j was incremented, and that's the way that inner for loops work. Inner for loops will work until the condition k is less than j is not true, or j is less than 3, and it'll just keep running until that's not true. But the difference between this inner for loop and the one above is that the inner for loop of k runs dependent upon the amount of times that j is. So if j is a big number, then k is going to run a lot of times, and that's just the way that these loops work. So if we're actually going to go through the code, it's going to start out as I equals 1, j equals 1, k equals 0. It's going to run k equals 0 and j is 1, so it's going to run one time, and it's going to print out a parenthesis, and then it's going to say I, which is 1, and then plus j, which is also 1, and then it's going to close those parentheses off, and so it'll look as if it had a parenthesis, then a number, then a comma, then another number, then a parenthesis, and that's the way it's going to print out, and it's going to print out 1, 1. Then this code is going to run, j is going to increment to 2, 2 is still less than 3, and k is 0, so 0 is less than 2, so it's going to run, it's going to print out I equals 1, and j equals 2, and then it's going to increment again, and it's going to run again, and it's going to print out the same exact thing twice. So here's the output for code snip B. As you can see, there's a parenthesis, then a number, then a comma, then a number, then a parenthesis, which was styled within the for loop, and the code is going to run as many times as the for loop will allow it to run. Here are some possible errors that you should look out for when dealing with loops. First of all, you need to make sure that the values are initialized before the loop is actually run, and if the system.out.println statement is outside of the loop, then the item that's getting printed out has to be initialized before the loop or above it. If not, there's going to be a scoping error, and it's not going to recognize that the variable was ever initialized in the actual program. Another thing to look for is where the system.out.println is. If it's within the loop, it's going to run as many times as the loop runs, and if it's below it or outside of the scope of the loop, it's only going to print out the final value that was taken from the loop itself. Thank you for watching my video, and I really hope that this helps you do well in your next exam.